You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is October 26th, 2025, and this is another episode of Lighthearted Light, where we look back at interviews from the past 6.5 years of Lighthearted. Today, in honor of Halloween, we're going to listen to an edited version of an interview with Dianna Stampfler about her book, Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses. It was first heard in a special edition of Lighthearted back in 2021. Dianna Stampfler has written countless articles for many Michigan travel and culture periodicals. In August 2004, she launched Promote Michigan to help market the people, places, and products of her home state. Dianna has also been researching Michigan's lighthouses for many years. In 2019, her book, Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses, was published by the History Press. Michigan has more lighthouses than any other state, with more than 120 dotting its expansive Great Lakes shoreline. Many of these lighthouses lay claim to haunted happenings. Let's listen to my conversation with Dianna Stampfler now. So what got you interested in the stories of haunted lighthouses and related subjects?
So in doing that early cataloging of the lights, and you, keep in mind, this is very early on in the internet days. I did a lot of my early research by actually calling to the museums and the historical societies in these communities to get information. And as they were giving me the details about the lighthouse and how tall the tower was, and if it was an active light, and if you could climb the tower, and if it had a museum, they would say, well, let me also tell you about our keepers. And I would start to hear early on a couple common themes. One was that we had a lot of female lighthouse keepers, and perhaps you and I can chat about that another time. But there were also these ghost stories that started to pop up. And the first few were just kind of casual, and I didn't really think much about them. But over time, I just became incredibly fascinated with these ghost stories and the keepers to which these stories were attached. And within about 3 or 4 years of being in that job, I developed a presentation that I would give to libraries and historical societies. Back before PowerPoint, I was actually presenting with slides, with a carousel and everything. And it, just like the love of lighthouses, the fascination with these ghost stories really took off. And at the time, I was also, my children were young, and my daughter, who is going to be 29 this year, she was about 4 years old when she had her first ghost experience. And so even though I didn't have any personal experiences back then, I was open to her stories and experiences. And I think that that really helped me appreciate and respect the stories that I was hearing from these lighthouses.
So something I've been asked a number of times over the years, I've done presentations on New England's haunted lighthouses, and people have asked, well, why are there so many lighthouse ghost stories? It seems like if you dig deep enough in the history of any lighthouse, you're probably going to find at least one ghost story in there somewhere. Why do you think there are so many lighthouse ghost stories?
Well, I think in many ways, lighthouse keepers didn't just take it for the job. They were drawn to it. They were passionate about it. We saw, so many keepers, particularly here in Michigan, where it was a family business, where brothers and fathers and sons and even grandfathers and grandsons tended light together. They served sometimes for many decades. We have some keepers that served over 40 years here in Michigan. And I think in those instances where I see a lot of the similarities is where a keeper is haunting a light that he lived in or she lived in for a considerable period of time. I think they have this lifelong and afterlife love affair with their lighthouse to the point that they just don't ever want to leave. And of course, then we also have several lighthouse keepers who died tragically. This was a demanding job physically, mentally, emotionally, often in remote locations. And everybody thinks it's such a romantic place and a romantic job. But can you imagine? I get winded climbing a lighthouse tower once. Can you imagine doing it day in and day out, year after year after year? But it was a job that I think that they were just born for. And if they lost their lives, whether it was in the course of the job or natural causes after a long extended stay at a light, I think that they just, they choose to stick around in this place that they that they love so dearly.
It's not that big a stretch of the imagination to think that, even after death, that in some way they're still connected or still present at that place.
Yeah, I think it's a job where you're looking out for others. You're a caregiver of that building. You're there to protect and serve. And I think people that have that natural quality in life are prone to carry that in their afterlife as well.
I always say the spirits of the keepers are with us one way or another, whether it's literally or figuratively. They're there.
Exactly.
And, some of the ghosts or spirits at the lighthouses seem to be related to shipwrecks. Whitefish Point is one of the places where that seems to be the case. There's some interesting stories there. Anything you'd like to say about that?
With so many souls lost at sea, some of the folks I talked to at Whitefish Point, they can attribute, dozens of spirits out there. And with so many lives lost, you can imagine that there are probably countless spirits in that particular area. And I think that contributes a lot to the energy that we draw from these lighthouses.
One of the things I love about your book that makes it, to me, different from other books I've seen on lighthouse ghost stories or haunted lighthouses, there's been quite a few of them that kind of recycle, or I don't know if regurgitate is a good word, but the same stories are told over and over again, sometimes with embellishment, but a lot of times there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of historical research behind them. But your book has a tremendous amount of historic facts, and it's not just the ghost stories. There's all the background related to them, a lot about the lives of lighthouse keepers and their families and so forth. And I really appreciate that fact. And there's also a lot about recent or current preservation efforts, which is really nice too. So I really see it as much a history book as it is a book about hauntings. Was that what you set out to do in the first place?
It really was. When I give my presentations, I say to people, even if you don't believe, that's okay, because really, I think only about 35% of the book itself is haunted based. I'm a history lover. My dad is a genealogist. And so, he has yet to find me a lighthouse keeper in my family tree. So I have to then search the family trees of these lighthouse keepers and find their stories to tell. But I think it's the backstory. It's the reason that the lights were built in a particular area, the industry that these communities supported, and the reason that there was so much maritime traffic, the keepers and how they got into the position. We had a lot of Civil War soldiers who were veterans and then became lighthouse keepers. And I wanted to tell their story in that regard. I wanted to tell the story of their descendants, some of them that became lighthouse keepers themselves, or, going back to Whitefish Point. One of the granddaughters of the keeper, Robert Carlson, his granddaughter, Bertha, she lived in that area until she was 90. She helped restore Whitefish Point. She helped it become the shipwreck museum campus that exists today. She donated many of her family's artifacts to the museum. So when you go through Whitefish Point and you see anything that has the Carlson name, those were donated by descendants. And I think, telling all of these pieces allows for a personal connection today, but also helps us inspire the next generation of kids. I think a lot of times today, kids are so drawn into technology and, VR, the virtual reality world, that they forget to look at what's here and how we are tied to the history of our place. And, so it really gave me a great opportunity in this book to share a lot of that history. And I love, I'm a researcher, and I love the scavenger hunt of it all. I love being able to find the name of a keeper and then go back and trace their family tree, or to go back and find elements of the history, find out where the Fresnel lens may be, or talk about those restoration projects, because it's so important that we keep these lights around for future generations so that they can enjoy them as much as we do.
I totally agree. Another thing I love about your book is that you have lots of accounts of people's personal encounters with spirits at lighthouses, which really adds a lot to the book, I think. I'm wondering, how did you get so many people to share their stories?
Well, it's funny because a couple of them were personal friends who, as I was telling them about my book, they're like, "Oh, I've got a story to tell for you." And so I didn't even have to ask. They were, totally open to sharing those with me. And then in doing some online research, finding other people's accounts, I didn't really just want to regurgitate stories, as you mentioned before, but Michigan has about 70 paranormal groups. And
Mm-hmm.
so if I saw that a group did an investigation, I would go and I would listen to their audio recordings. I would send them follow-up questions, ask them things. And one of the groups that I connected with, which is in the Upper Peninsula, the UP Paranormal Group, they run a big paranormal conference in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan every August. And we've become friends because of this. And they've written a couple books and they have a radio show. So I've been on their show and we've been out for drinks before. And we always go out for drinks in a bar that's haunted because, why would you not? And I think that's really been, part of the joy of working on this because it's not just my telling of stories. It's telling other people's stories that gives me the happiness in this.
So I'm wondering, of all the great stories in the book, and there's a lot of juicy ones in there, but is there one particular story that's especially compelling to you that really stands out?
Well, it was interesting. There are actually about 130 lights in Michigan, and about 40 or 50 of them are haunted or have some type of story. And I had to pick which ones, which was great with my publisher. They let me pick. And I picked 13, right? Because if you're going to talk haunted things, that's the most logical number of chapters to have, right?
Well, I was born on a Friday the 13th, so I don't think it's an unlucky number.
So you understand the draw for that, right?
Yes.
So that was, kind of how I nailed that down. But one of the ones I think that sticks out to me was one of the first lights that I actually, quote unquote, investigated. And it was before I'd ever done anything. I've been on paranormal investigations now off and on, but gosh, right around 2004, I think it was, I went out to South Manitou Island, which is now an uninhabited island. It's a rustic island owned by the national park, part of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. And I had given a couple presentations in the village of Empire for the Manitou Memorial Society, which kind of maintains the historical structures on both North and South Manitou Island. And I said, okay, I'll come up and I'll give these presentations, but here's the trade-off. I want to go to South Manitou Island and go and see the lighthouse. And it's a place I'd never been. Well, they rolled out the red carpet and they allowed me to stay in the Coast Guard building for a couple of nights, which was great because it had a bed and power and a bathroom. And the rest of the island is all rustic. I mean, it's all rustic camping. And so at the end of the day, when the boat went back with all the day trippers, the park ranger tossed me the keys to the lighthouse and said, lock it up when you're done. Mm-hmm. And I just was overwhelmed. So my friend and I that were there, we kind of had a little dinner. And then toward the end, it was in the summer. So toward the end of the day, I don't know, around 8 or 9 o'clock, we made our way to the light, and sunset, was just before 10. And so we had heard stories about the ghosts there, mostly in the breezeway or the causeway that connects the tower to the light. And the tower was open to the public to climb, but you can't, even today, you can't go through the house part yet. So we thought, well, we're going to go through and we're going to see if we can have any kind of experience. So we walk and we sit on the first landing. We sit there about a half an hour. And then we kind of make our way up, and I think there were 3 landings until we got to the top of the tower. And we sat there and we waited and we listened, and we never had any real experience. We never really heard anything. But when we got to the top, we got to watch the sunset, and the moon came out, and it was a full moon. It was actually the end of July. It was a blue moon, so the second full moon of the month. And I kept thinking, it's a blue moon. It's the sunset. There's got to be a ghostly encounter going on somewhere tonight, right? And we even consumed at least 1, but probably 2 bottles of wine during that excursion. And still, we did not have a ghost encounter.
Wow.
But that was, I think, the first time that I actively went out searching or listening for ghost experiences. And I think even though I'd been telling the stories for 10 years at that point, I didn't go out and actually seek these experiences out. That was the very first one. And I think that's one of the reasons that one sticks out. And then the story around the ghost there is it's believed to be members of the Sheridan family, the mother and father, and a 9-month-old baby of theirs drowned when they were coming back from the mainland in a boat in March of 1878. And they all lost their lives that day. But I'm also friends with some of the descendants of that family. And I think that that's another reason that, people ask you what your favorite lighthouse is. And I tell them, you can't ask that. It's like asking who your favorite child is, right?
Yep.
And I give that disclaimer, but then I almost always say it's South Manitou Island.
One of the other chapters in the book that I really thought was extremely interesting was the one on Waugoshant's Light, which do I remember right that local people call it Wobbly Shanks? Is that right?
They do call it Wobbly Shanks. And it's more wobbly now than ever before, let me tell you.
Yes, it sure is. Speaking of ghostly, it looks pretty ghostly itself these days, the lighthouse. Waugoshant's Light on Lake Michigan. So there were multiple tragedies at that lighthouse, but the story that I found especially interesting was about that one guy who disappeared and they believed he died. But you found there were records also that show he died later. In fact, I think there were two other possibilities, two other accounts of him dying later. So it's quite intriguing and kind of confusing. What do you think really happened there?
Well, this is another interesting one. This is one of the earliest ghost stories I ever heard about Lake Michigan Lights. And John Herman was the keeper. And I had always been told this local legend was that on October 14th of 1900, that the John Herman, who loved two things, he loved a good stiff drink and a good practical joke, that he returned from a tavern in Mackinac City and thought it would be funny to lock his assistant keeper in the tower. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a beautiful lighthouse, or was back in the day. I believe it to be the only birdcage lantern in Michigan at the time. So he locks his assistant keeper, and you can almost vision the assistant keeper running up the spiral staircase and coming out the top of that birdcage lantern room and yelling out at John Herman below, saying, "This is not funny. This is not a joke. Let me out of here." Yep. Well, 2 hours later, the guy's still up there. And you can imagine he's just livid at this point. And I'm sure he's yelling more expletives out to John Herman below. But John Herman never unlocks the door. Well, after a little bit of time after that, the assistant sends a distress call to what I assume is McGulpin Point Light in Mackinac City. It's the nearest lighthouse and not very far by land. So that assistant comes over, unlocks the door, and that assistant keeper is ready to wring John Herman's neck, right? As you would imagine. Mm-hmm. Well, they go looking and looking and looking, and they never find him. And he's never seen again. And they believe, as the legend was told to me over 20 years ago, that in his drunken stupor, John Herman fell over the edge and drowned, and his body just washed away. Well, over the course of the next 10 years, this became one of the hardest lighthouses to find a staff to work because it was so haunted, they say, that no man would accept the position. Silverware would rattle, doors would open, just all of these strange things. And everybody always attributed them to John Herman. And the local legend is that that's why they decommissioned the lighthouse in 1910. Mm-hmm. In actuality, they had built White Shoal, which is the beautiful candy cane stripe or the barber pole stripe light that we have in the Straits of Mackinac. And Waugoshant's became an unnecessary light at that point. But over the years, the legend and the story continued to grow. And years ago, met Chris West, who has the Waugoshant's Historical Preservation Society, and he told me all kinds of ghost stories. Another friend of mine, George Schulender, told me about some of his ghost stories, and it just kept going on and on. Well, as I was doing the final research, I was enlisting the help of my dad, a genealogist, and I had given him a list of all the lighthouses and the keepers that I knew and the deaths, and he was helping me track down burial sites, cemeteries, death records, newspaper articles, whatever we could find to help tell these stories. And, I had told him a little bit about what I knew of each of these keepers. Well, he emails me back and he says, I have an interesting lead on that keeper, the drunk one who fell over the edge of the lighthouse. And I said, oh, you have some information about John Herman. This is great. He goes, he didn't fall over the edge and drown. He died of a heart attack on Mackinac Island. I have his death certificate. Well, it's interesting because clearly he didn't lock anybody in the lantern room on the night of October 14th of 1900 because he died at 1:30 that afternoon. However, imagine this. Maybe that assistant keeper was locked in the tower, and the reason they never found a body was because it was not a human that locked it in there. Maybe it was John Herman's ghost that did it.
Holy cow.
Right? I mean, that would answer a lot of questions about why they never saw him again. I don't know. That to me was one of those big aha moments. And, but the date was right. The date that was always told to me was October 14th of 1900. That's the day he died. He had a heart attack 3 or 4 days prior to that while he was on Mackinac Island, but he died at his death certificate is dated 1:30 in the afternoon on the 14th.
Another chapter in the book that is very interesting is, well, they're all interesting, but the one on the old Presque Isle, or Presqu'Île. I always get mixed up as which one is Presque Isle and which one is Presqu'Île.
You and me both.
Many people believe the spirit of a former caretaker, it was, relatively recent, is seen there. And I've seen things about this on TV, I think once or twice before too. One of the odd things about it is that there's no light in the lighthouse. It was deactivated a long time ago. So what's your view on all that? Is there a light where there should be no light there?
The gentleman you were referring to, his name was George Parrish, and he and his wife Lorraine were caretakers in the 70s, 80s, and until George died in the early 90s. They ran the museum and the gift shop and everything. And after he died was when all of these things started to happen. Mm-hmm. So in September of 2019, I was in the community giving my presentation tied to my book. I had about 100 people out. And afterward, we went and took a tour of the light after dark. But during the presentation, I asked everybody, how many of you here have seen the light shining out at Old Presqu'Île? And probably 80% of the hands went up. I said, how many of you have seen it more than once? At least half. Mm-hmm. So people in the community have seen it regularly. I drove back and forth down that road a couple times that night, hoping to see it, and I did not. Even walking around the grounds, I didn't have any experience. But I also met members of the Garrity family, and they were the last keepers at that light when it was decommissioned. And they actually think that there is another spirit there of Patrick Garrity, who was the patriarch of that family. So there may be more than one there. Mm-hmm. And actually, there's probably at least 3, because we heard of another gentleman who was friends of the owner in the 1930s. And a medium that I met in another event told me about that experience that she had. And at a presentation of mine once, a woman came up to me and she said, that you showed the picture of the owner's friend in the 30s. She said, that's the guy I remember. She said, one day I toured there when I was in high school because we had a family cottage nearby, and I misstepped and almost fell backwards out of the light, down the light stairs. And she said, I felt 2 hands on my back push me forward to save me. And when I turned around, that's the man I saw. Mm. So, wow. I mean, they just give you goosebumps when people tell you these personal stories.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I have one final question for you for bonus points. Okay. So what was your favorite part about writing Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses?
I think a lot of it is digging in a little more into the history. I mean, I casually have known these stories for years, but this really forced me to dig in deeper, to not just take the legend that I've heard before as reality. So searching for the sources that create these, I guess, fact from fiction. And you just get, this excitement of researching something new and having new encounters. So I think for me, it's that treasure hunt, that scavenger hunt, that find of looking for the information that I find most enjoyable.
Well, it's to everybody's benefit that you did that scavenger hunt or all those scavenger hunts and put the book together, because I very highly recommend it for anybody interested in lighthouses. Period. Again, it's a great collection of stories, ghost stories, and just history, lives of keepers, and so forth. So it gets my recommendation. Thank you so much, Dianna. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
In 2022, Dianna Stampfler published a new book called Death and Lighthouses of the Great Lakes, A History of Murder and Misfortune. In that book, Dianna uncovers the facts behind some of the Great Lakes' darkest lighthouse tales, and she also debunks some fiction that has been mistaken for fact. All of Dianna's books are available on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, as well as from ArcadiaPublishing.com. Be sure to check out uslhs.org to learn more about tours, preservation grants, and everything the U.S. Lighthouse Society has to offer. Memberships and donations help to support this podcast. If you listen on a platform that allows you to, please rate and review us. We will be back with a new episode next week with an interview about the lighthouse in Lorain, Ohio. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thanks so much for listening, and keep a good light.